Welcome to the New York Studio School on a wintry spring evening. Two announcements. First, one, please turn off your cell phones, pagers, beepers, etc. And you would have noticed on your way in, one of the ways of getting out of here quickly, should there be need to, as well as over your right shoulders, another exit from what is, during normal times of day, a drawing studio. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome back to the studio school Richard Hennessy. Rumor has it that in 2005, when he last spoke here, the title of his talk was, "You Can't Join the Game Because You Broke the Rules." And this time around, I'm especially intrigued by the title of his talk, "You Can't Break the Rules If You're Not in the Game." And reviewing Richard's resume makes one feel as if he's up to some mind-bending with us, as his resume belies the whole notion of not being in the game. Richard attended the Eastman School of Music from 1954 to 59, and there are traces of those experiences for sure within his paintings, and as well as other accomplishments, including record covers. And Columbia College in 1963, where he received his BA, and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU from 63 to 66. But as to being in the game, how to account then, or being out of the game, for having his works represented in such distinguished public collections as the Metropolitan Museum, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, MoMA, the Brooklyn Museum, the Albright Knox, Philadelphia Museum of Art, San Francisco Museum, and the Carnegie, to name just a sampling of the distinguished list. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Richard, and I hope you will break down some of the intrigue that you've created in this title this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know Lee Krasner well, but I spent one evening with her, and since we were only 4 people, and the other 2 were our host and hostess, I got to talk a lot with her. She told me a story which I found very intriguing. She and her husband, Jackson Pollock, were home one evening in separate rooms. She heard a resounding crash and proceeded to investigate. Jackson was seated in an armchair in the living room, and there on the floor, the source of the thud was a very large book about the work of Picasso. She said, "Darling, what's wrong?" He had his he had his hands clutching his head, and he unclutched one hand, pointed at the book, and said in despairing tones, "That guy has thought of everything." Well, it's easy to understand. A lot of people were in thrall to Picasso, and I myself consider myself a great admirer of his work. In fact, you're going to have to indulge me because my admiration for him is extravagant, and I personally regard him as the greatest draftsman that has ever lived. I happen to love drawing very much and have studied it over the years, and I myself have not drawn very much. I'm so in love with color and the brush, but obviously, you know, for mass and for concentrated energy, you would go to Michelangelo. Leonardo, all you need is one drawing. That would be Leda and the Swan from Chatsworth. You know, there's the airy, athletic elegance of Tiepolo. There are all these other wonderful draftsmen. Each one of them is, say, a mountain, but someone like Picasso is really a continent. And if you stop to think what the origin of the word style is, it's stylus, the Latin for a writing instrument. And I remember being deeply, profoundly fascinated as a child by all the styles in which he worked. And it seems to me the source of his invention was his draftsmanship, his ability to draw, and that forms emerged with enormous freedom. And he became someone who lit fires in so many people's souls, inspired so many. I think he was probably the greatest artist of the 20th century, and that I would include literary, architecture, all of that in that estimation. His influence was everywhere. So it's not hard to understand why poor Pollock felt so rivalry with Picasso. Ambition can be a terrible handicap because it makes you want to triumph, and it also makes it hard to learn because you're impatient. A great talent like Picasso's, either you've got to go so far to get around it, or you've got to barrel right through it. But you know, what Blake said, in the destructive element, immerse. And Picasso, it seems to me, is someone that you can dive right into. Of course, for myself, Picasso wasn't the threat to me that he was to Pollock, because I had the intervening great painters of the New York School to show how you could get out of that impasse. As a child, I think I was about 14 years old, I used some of my paper route money to buy a big reproduction of Picasso. It was a blue period. I got it framed. It was called The Tragedy. And there are two very monumental figures huddled together. I assumed as a child they were husband and wife. You get a suggestion of sea coast. They seem to have survived from a wreck and are mourning people who drowned. And there's a little boy standing there next to them. He's holding on to one of the parents' hands, but he's looking away, and he's rather sharp-featured. I think he was probably about 5 or 6, and clearly looking somewhere else. And I can't vouch now for what I felt. Why did I want that? But that painting spoke to me, and I think the humanity of Picasso's work, and that he could appeal to a child in that way, and there was something that spoke to me directly in that. Now, this, as you will recognize, is called The Kitchen. This is from 1948. This is quite a large painting. It's at MoMA. I'm going to show you another one as well. Now if we get, this is backward. Do you think we? No, we don't. I'm afraid the whole thing must be. What? Okay, it doesn't matter. We've got this one. This in the current hanging at the Museum of Modern Art, this Picasso appears on the wall, on one wall, and on the other side is the room where all the Pollocks are. And I think they wanted to make a point here. You see how much ground is exposed, and I think they want to make a connection between this and the airiness of a really quite lovely Pollock, which they have in the next room. But the majesty of this painting and the monumentality of it are really extraordinary. This is 99 inches wide and 69 inches high. Forgive me, I'm going to be very pedantic about the size of the paintings because reproductions are so deceptive, and I think it makes quite a difference. The freedom with which this is done is really quite flabbergasting. I mean, there's no place to hide here. And the range of touch and invention and fantasy is truly wonderful. And if you look in there, I think you can see a face or two, which is always amusing. I think, and this is just a guess, some of you may have a better notion of this than I, who were around at the time. My sense of it is that Picasso's reputation peaks in the 40s for Americans, and that after that his influence wanes. Now I've asked myself, what was that book that was on the floor that Pollock pointed to? There was a show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1939. There was a catalog by Alfred Barr. It was entitled Picasso, 40 Years of His Art. Now, in 1946, a much revised and greatly enlarged volume appeared, again by Barr, called Picasso, 50 Years of His Art. Maybe it was that one. I don't know. The Museum of Modern Art had their eye on Pollock. They bought She-Wolf, which is from 1943, from his first show, which was the Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century. I think yes, here we go. This is the great masterpiece, the Charnel House from 1945. This, again, is very large, 99 inches wide, just like the other one, and 79 inches high, influenced by Picasso had heard about the concentration camps, and this reflects his feelings about it. I would ask you to, if you can see over in the lower right-hand corner, you can see some charcoal work, which he has left exposed. So there really is a difference between when he's got a brush in his hand and when he's working with charcoal. Painting with, it's easy to think of something like either one of these as drawing, but to do this with a brush and the sureness of touch and the firmness is really quite extraordinary. I would like you now to see, this is obviously a Pollock. It's from 1943. It's called Pacify. Now, you see this rather shallow, shelf-like space. There's a great influence here of Picasso. But what I would point out to you is Pollock's lack of sureness of touch. And he worries the paint. And I sometimes wonder, I think that what's worrying him is that every time he puts a brush to canvas, he wants to do a Picasso. And so then there's a kind of a retreat from that and a kind of fudging which goes on there. You can see how frustrating and anguishing something like that must be. I've often wanted to think of the 20th century as the graphic century. And I think that Picasso's enormous draftsmanly gifts gave the entire century a swerve, a push towards the graphic, which it wouldn't have had otherwise. Now, by graphic, I mean think of artists like Mondrian or Franz Klein or the late Fernand Léger. A continuous white ground, black figuration. That all heavily influenced by Picasso. And of course what it means is that color becomes homeless. Picasso on the right, obviously, you don't need color, you don't want it, but you can see how this happens. Now, Pollock was one of the first abstract expressionists who made it uptown, and had quite a few shows in the 40s. And he had 2 one-man shows in 1949 at Betty Parsons. That was the same year that Life magazine published an enormous article about him entitled Pollock, the greatest painter in America, ? Now, America had been looking for a hero, and I think that became an urgent quest because Picasso became a communist in 1944. I can't help but think that caused a lot of consternation among the plutocrats on the board of MoMA, for instance. They needed their own man, and there was an opening there which Pollock was ready to fill. I'd like to go into the background of Pollock's great innovation, which obviously were the all-over drip paintings, which emerged in 1947. We all know that automatic writing came in for a big revival with the Surrealists. Pollock was befriended by Peggy Guggenheim, who gave him a monthly stipend. She was at the time married to Max Ernst. There's an absolutely wonderful painting, which if you saw the Max Ernst show that was at the Met a year or so ago, you would have seen it there. It's from the Menil collection. It shows a gigantic, monstrous bird with a great long serpentine neck, and 2 look like maybe the bird's children or 2 little bird students, and she is instructing them how to paint. And there's an easel, and there's an empty canvas, and on that canvas are a few little splatters of paint, and they certainly seem to be showing the way to something. Now, there's a deep background in America to automatic writing. Did you know that William James wrote about automatic writing? Gertrude Stein was a student of his when she was an undergraduate at Radcliffe. She actually she co-authored an article about automatic writing, and was the single author of another article on automatic writing, which appeared in the Psychological Review. Now, I don't know how many of you have read The Making of Americans. I think there are probably a lot of specialists in Gertrude Stein who've never read every word. I was enthralled to her reputation in the 20s, and in my 20s, and I in fact read the entire thing. I can't imagine ever doing it again, but certainly that was a lot of automatic writing in there. I'm bringing it up to show just give you a sense of how deep something like this goes, and there's a great reluctance among appreciators of Pollock's works to even allow the notion of automatic writing to come in here, but I think it's important. Another thing which I think is very important, again, the background, the American background. The Pentecostals recently had their 100th anniversary, so there were articles about it. In 1906, in Los Angeles, the movement had its modern birth. A woman stood up in the gathering and started speaking in tongues. Now, it made headlines, and before we knew it, the Pentecostals were formed. Now, Pentecost, as you know, was some 50 days after Passover. The Holy Ghost appeared to the assembled disciples, 12 disciples, in the form of a cloven tongue. Now, if you see paintings, you see a lot of middle-aged men sitting around in a room with little flames over their heads. That's what that's about. And of course, the gift of tongues meant that they could go out and spread the gospel and be understood by those who were pure of heart. And so the language problem was solved. Now I want you to imagine in 1906 in Los Angeles, after all, we're talking about the disadvantaged, the downtrodden, the people who felt the lash of the tongue, commands, sarcasm, that sort of thing. You can imagine what sort of liberation it represents to speak in tongues. And I think this, and for the tongue-tied, the yearning for eloquence and for virtuosity. I'm trying to establish a context for what I think happened with Pollock, a man notoriously tongue-tied, who yearned for virtuosity, who yearned to be eloquent, and yearned to top Picasso. Now, one of the things about automatic writing is that there were various devices you had to eliminate friction. There was something called a planchette. It had little wheels on it. You rested your hand on it, and then you could be guided by, you thought you were being guided by a spirit or something that was seeking expression. There was also, your hand might be put in a sling, and then you'd have great freedom of movement. I'm bringing this up because you see, what I see in Pollock is a desire to escape the friction of working on the surface. Now, of course, for some people's friction is another person's traction, but you could see the liberation he's seeking, and I think this is very American. What, of course, Pollock did was to discover something we've learned to call process art. And my lecture title is aimed at this. You can't break the rules if you're not in the game. I think that Pollock invented a new game. My question would be how interesting it is. You've heard all these CEOs, when they're being hauled into court for various forms of malfeasance, they always say, they wave their hands and say, oh, I'm a big picture guy. I leave the details to others. Well, where did they learn that one? When the details are produced without anything actually touching the surface, my problem with it is their lack of, that the detail lacks significance or meaning. It's not a register of intention, which is the thing that interests me. Also, any automatic, anything that's produced automatically and without touch, without actually touching the surface, lacks scale. When you work with a brush, your brush could be a mile, the tip of your brush could be 2 miles away from you. You're placing it in space in a very, very careful way. Now, I think there are a lot of people who don't miss detail, but then I think it's because they want things to be easier. What I have a word for this kind of work, it would be open work. That as you look through, and the space that you see, definitely there's space, it's a virtual space. Now, virtual space, say in a mirror or in a photograph, that's virtual space. It has all the qualities of real space except reality. Any rectangle, if you look into it, as you get away from the edges, you start getting this feeling that there's space there. That, it seems to me, is the space that you see in a Pollock. The pictorial space is ambiguous, and I would distinguish it from virtual space. Pictorial space has multiple readings. I'd like you to make a thought experiment. Imagine one of your favorite Franz Halses and your jolly burger with a big belly, There's no question where the mass is and where the space is. Your eye works around this wonderfully rotund figure. But you're drawn in by the brushstrokes. And sooner or later, everybody is looking at that black satin with all those wonderful strokes it's made up of. And of course, suddenly, your eye plunges in. And what had been an obstruction, what had been solid matter, becomes space. And that's a kind of ambiguity I have in mind. And in a more complicated way, think of yourself as a dolphin that's going in and out of water like this, diving and going in. Every shape can either be read as mass or as a window or as an opening. And this makes a wonderfully exciting activity for the mind. It's very stimulating. When I was recently at the Modern, I saw that there's a lot of what I would call window space, and where you look through the open work into not pictorial space, but the virtual space of a rectangle. I happened to be there in the Bryce Marden show, and there it was. And what I also saw there was that when the space is not illusionistic, it becomes terribly important to have enormous canvases, because then it becomes the literal space of these gigantic fields. Now this is very deceptive, because this painting is, I really can't quite call it a painting. It's 4 feet by 6 feet. It was done in 1950. It's on glass. It's very hard to see that here. I think I once saw a photograph of it where you could actually see the room behind it. There are pebbles, there's metal mesh, there are string shells on it, and obviously paint, but you look right through. It's on glass, you look right through. And I think this is a kind of slam dunk demonstration of where Pollock's thinking was. And I have actually never seen this, and I don't recall that it was in that enormous show at the Modern. I assume it still exists, very fragile, obviously, but I think it's it really comes terribly close to kitsch, and but Pollock lost faith in these procedures, and I think in the last 3 years of his life, when he started touching the canvas again, things start getting interesting, but we'll never know where that might have gone. Now, this is also from 1950, as and you no doubt recognize Excavation, which is in Chicago, and quite a large painting. Now, I want you to think a little about the title, Excavation, Breaking Ground. The Pollock is about breaking through. But, you know, you're breaking through into what? The vacuum, unshaped, non-pictorial space. Pictorial space can become incredibly complicated. Let me give you a very literal sense of this. Imagine a 3 foot by 3 foot painting. Now, imagine that there's ambiguity as to which is figure, which is ground. So you've got, if you read it one way, you have 9 square feet. If you reverse it, you've got another 9 square feet. In other words, starting out from 9 square feet, you now have 18 square feet. Now, what if you can't decide which is the color of the ground? Maybe there are 4 possibilities, and there are ways of doing this. So you add up all these square feet. It's not long before you've got 100, you're looking at a 9 square foot painting, but you might have 100 square, your mind is dealing with 100 square feet of information. Now, this is the opposite of a vacuum. Philosophers call it a plenum, something that's full. And I think you can see that in Excavation, you have the possibility for a tremendous amount of mass. Max Kozloff came up with a wonderful phrase for what de Kooning was on to here. He called it bulk space, which I think is wonderfully evocative and suggestive. Now, I met, how do I turn that one off? Oh, you have to turn it off yourself? Okay, well, it doesn't matter then. It's all right. Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, no, no, I want the other, yeah. Yeah. I met Barnett Newman on one occasion. I don't know if any of you had ever been to any of the internationals at the Guggenheim. They were wonderful, wonderful shows. I greatly miss them. They were of artists from all over the world. I always used to look forward to them. And I was the guest of Henry Geldzahler that night. It must have been 1965. I'm not absolutely sure. And Newman was there with his wife, Anna Lee, and he was sweating bullets. And he said, "Oh, you must come, you've got to see my painting. It's been so poorly lit. It's absolutely a disaster." So we processed up the ramp to the first, that big L-shaped room. And there on one wall was an orange Barnett Newman with the zips that we know so well. But on the other wall was, I thought I could see what the problem was an enormous Miro, 106 inches by 140 inches, bleu d'or. And a sensational painting, manganese blue, with a great vermilion slash coming down from the upper left-hand corner, and some little families of black rocks, beautifully brushed in surface. And it really seemed to me that the problem was not the lighting, but the competition. About 10 years ago, when the Beaubourg was being remodeled by Gaal Lenti, they lent some of their collection to the Guggenheim. And in one room, I hadn't realized that the Beaubourg had acquired the 3 Miros, bleu 1, 2, 3. And there they were in this room, utterly glorious, masterpieces. But I'm talking about Newman now and showing you this rather interesting project of Mies van der Rohe. It's from 1938. It's for the Resor House out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The house was never built. But you can see, it's a photograph with, talk about a picture window, and with these zips. I suspect the narrower zips were for a door or some way of opening the glass. But again, what I want to suggest is that the space that Newman was in, and Newman, by the way, was very interested in architecture. I consider it quite likely that he knew this project. This is now at the Museum of Modern Art. And I suspect he was influenced by this. But even if he wasn't, I want to make this point. Here is photography space, or virtual space. It's not pictorial space. And again, Newman is famous for his enormous canvases. When I was walking around in Museum of Modern Art, I saw that there were an awful lot of paintings which seemed to be open work. If you go there now, there's an immense Twombly in the great hall. And I don't know, it might be 25 feet high. And with his rather characteristic sort of blackboard, circles, and he fills the entire surface with these, so that the canvas is thought of as a container. It's filled. Now, this is something I also noticed about Bryce Marden, that those lines in the later work where he gets a little interested in color lazily sort of ricochet back and forth from the sides. They ricochet back from the sides of the canvas, so that, again, the canvas is thought of as a container for these forms. There was also, at the Modern, there's an Agnes Martin. Again, open work, very graphic, and all of these artists I'm talking about, the work is very graphic without necessarily being about drawing. There's a difference between graphisms and drawing. Drawing is, again, attempts to create ambiguity and multiple readings. That is, when you look, you might see mass, something that's obstructing light, something that you have to work around to get to see the space, or it could be space. When these things alternate in your mind where you can't settle whether it's mass or space, that produces in your mind an effect of radiance. I cannot emphasize how important that is, because radiance is, I think, a very desirable quality to have. It's not in the work of art, it's in your mind. It's this toing and froing that creates that illusion. Now, of course, I would say, for Pollock took leave of one of his senses, and that sense was touch. And, we say out of touch or touching, someone who's lost touch. I think that, and of course what he also achieved was a kind of out-of-body experience, which everybody seems to find very desirable in America. But I always say out of body, out of mind. That is, there isn't enough there for the mind to work on. Now, I think that Pollock invented a very attractive procedure, and that many of his paintings are genuinely lovely. What I don't find them is interesting or engaging. And I find the lack of significant detail limits how meaningful they can be. Now, it takes one to know one. So, I want to show you where I started out. I was thinking of the field as a container. Now, that's decorative thinking. These are my five-finger exercises. This is something, a series, I did dozens of them when I was just starting out working at a drafting table in my kitchen and buying materials from the local stationery store because I was too shy to go into a real art store. And you can see these star-like forms. These are the sorts of forms you'd find in a quilt, which is exactly where I found them. And I did lots of variations. But you see, you never know what you're learning. After all, the approach here was very decorative. You make a little a drawing, and then you fill it in. You're not composing as you paint. I think it's that's the most interesting, to learn how to compose as you paint, and it's also the most difficult. However, you can be learning things that you don't even know you're learning. I had a dream when I came to the end of all of these, and these, by the way, are quite small, and the material is casein. I had a dream in which I saw my little brush, which I had been using, touching the page and depositing paint. And I saw it in my dream over and over again. So that without my even knowing it consciously, I was seeing that brush deposit paint. So that happened tens of thousands of times. I eliminated all sign of brushwork, but I was really learning a great deal in a very concentrated and rapid way. Now, enter Barbara Rose. She had been following my efforts rather closely, and this is the next series I did. It's called The Gardens of China. And she said, "Oh, Richard, you've got to do these big size." And she was married to Frank Stella at the time, and they lived on Jones Street. They had in a loft building, 3 stories. Richard Meyer had fixed up the top floor for them and a third of the second floor, but Frank wasn't using the spaces, so she said, why don't you use the space and paint there? So I marched in, and these are studies. These are not what I did, but I did quite literal, very literal copies of these. And the one on the right, you see, this is open work, decorative thinking. I'm filling the surface up, so the surface is thought of as passive, and you look through. These were all done 40 years ago. This is like 67, 68. The one on the right ended up being 7 feet by 13 feet. I eliminated the little circles in the upper left-hand corner, and the one on the left became a 6 foot by 12 foot painting. Well, that was enough of that sort of thing, and I did 4 other paintings while I was down there, and I'm happy to report they loosened up considerably. But that was where I started out. Now, what I'd like to do is show you a few paintings in which I think you can see that I'm working out what I call my 20th century inheritance. The graphic side to my work, continuous ground, certainly on the left-hand side, although it's a little confused by the brown shapes on the bottom and the side. As you see, there's a lot of drawing. Now, if you want to talk about ambiguity of color, this would be a good place to go into it. You can see that the ground is yellow, but these shapes in front of it, the yellow is being lifted off the ground and is the color of the figure. Now, if you can it's a nice trick if you can make the figure be the same color as the ground, and it creates an effect of radiance. This is called Deus Ex Machina on the left. It's a very large painting. It's 6 foot by 12 feet. And you'll notice that those are supposed to be subway doors on the left-hand side. That's when graffiti was big. And you see the windows and the sort of like someone who's put graffiti on the subway doors. This was an enormous effort. I think there was a lot of autobiography in this. I think those forms is some kind of family portrait. Father, mother, me off over there reading a book or something. When I finished this painting, it was for the first and last time in my life, I sat and I looked at it, and my entire body radiated, it throbbed. And it was as if I suppose that was the serotonin or the dopamine or the rush of it. And it was as if my entire body was saying, yes, yes, yes. I think that painting is a deeply physical activity, and it expresses the mind-body continuum in a very, very deep way. Eye-hand coordination. After all, we're often standing. There's a tremendous amount of walking involved in painting. The eye really is an extension of the mind. It's the part of the mind that's exposed to the world. I'm going to be emphasizing this mind-body continuum, and painting for me is not an out-of-body experience. The one on the right has a very ambitious title. It's from 1984. It's called The Birth of Time, no less. And I think you can see what I mean when I say dolphin space.